If you're so smart, then quote Code 4789. The judge mocked the gardener and was left speechless. John Thompson stood there in the Portland courthouse, clutching crumpled papers in his work-worn hands from years of laboring in the soil. Judge Richard Wilson looked at him with that superior air he often used with simple folks like him. "If you really understand the law as you claim," the judge said with an ironic smile, "then quote me Code 4789 on special urban adverse possession. I bet you don't even know what adverse possession means." Silence fell over the courtroom. The three children of Mrs. Elizabeth, John's employer who had passed 3 months prior, exchanged satisfied glances. Finally, the gardener would be put in his place. How dare this simple man challenge their wish to nullify the will that left half the property to him? Mr. William Parker, the lawyer hired by the heirs, smiled confidently. He'd warned them it would be easy to humiliate the gardener before the judge. People like him didn't have the knowledge to defend themselves in legal matters. John took a deep breath and adjusted the cap he always wore while working. 22 years tending the Miller family's garden. 22 years watching Mrs. Elizabeth be abandoned by her own children who only showed up when they needed money. Code 4.789 of July 5, 2007, John began firmly, establishes special urban adverse possession for those who have occupied uninterrupted and without opposition for 5 years, an urban area of up to 250 square meters, whose ownership they cannot prove. The judge stopped smiling. The heir's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mrs. Elizabeth's children exchanged worried glances. Article 2, John continued, special urban adverse possession may be invoked as a defense, with the ruling serving as title for registration in the Property Records Office. Judge Wilson leaned forward, now paying real attention. How did this gardener know the law's details so precisely? "What's more," John went on, "I've lived in the back of the property for 17 years, with Mrs. Elizabeth's full consent. I have all the receipts showing I made improvements using my own money." Karen, Mrs. Elizabeth's eldest daughter, whispered something nervously to her brother Brian beside her. They never imagined the gardener would know his legal rights. "And there's more." John opened an old folder he'd brought. "Here are receipts for all the upgrades I made to the back house where I live. New roof in 2019, kitchen remodel in 2020, new electrical wiring in 2021. All paid for out of my pocket, with written permission from Mrs. Elizabeth." The court clerk, Ms. Margaret, a grey-haired woman who'd worked there 30 years, whispered something to the judge. Even she was surprised by the gardener's knowledge. Judge Wilson checked something on his computer, clearly unsettled by how the hearing was unfolding. This wasn't how he'd expected things to go. "Where did you learn about these laws?" the judge asked, his tone now completely different from the initial mockery. John looked at Mrs. Elizabeth's children before answering. He saw desperation growing in their eyes. "I studied law by correspondence for 15 years, Your Honor, every night after work, by candlelight when the power went out. Mrs. Elizabeth even helped me with some books when she learned about my studies." "That's a lie," shouted Michael, the youngest son. "Mum never told us about this." "Because you never asked about her life," John replied with sadness in his voice. "When was the last time you spent a whole evening talking with your mother?" Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Brian lowered his eyes, knowing John was right. Karen tried to hide it, but she also knew she'd rarely visited her mother in recent years. "I have a witness," John said calmly. "Ms. Dorothy, who worked as a maid in the house for 12 years before retiring. She can confirm how Mrs. Elizabeth treated me." Mr. Parker stood up quickly. "Objection. This witness wasn't previously disclosed." "Actually, she was." John showed a document. "I submitted the list to the clerk's office yesterday. Ms. Dorothy is waiting outside." The judge allowed the witness to enter. Ms. Dorothy walked into the courtroom, a 68-year-old woman with neatly styled white hair, wearing her best navy blue dress. "Ms. Dorothy," the judge asked, "can you tell us about the relationship between Mrs. Elizabeth and the gardener, John?" "Your Honor," the woman replied firmly, Mrs. Elizabeth treated John like he was her own son. She always said he was the only company she had. Her children, well, they only showed up when they needed something. Karen stood up indignantly. That's not true. We always took care of our mother. Young lady, Miss Dorothy stared at her firmly. I worked in that house for 12 years. I saw when you all left to live your own lives and left your mother alone. John was the one who took her to the doctor, kept her company during sleepless nights, and cared for her when she was sick. Brian tried to interrupt, but Miss Dorothy continued. And one more thing. Mrs. Elizabeth always said that when she passed, she wanted to leave something for John. She said he deserved it, because he was the only one who stood by her till the end. Mr. Parker requested a recess, clearly shaken by the turn of events. Mrs. Elizabeth's children huddled in a corner, whispering tensely among themselves. Did you know about this? Brian asked Karen angrily. How would I know? We never paid attention to these things, she replied, starting to realize the magnitude of their mistake. Now we're in a tough spot, Michael muttered, if this gardener really knows the law. During the recess, Brian approached John in the courthouse hallway. Listen here, John, he said quietly. I can make you an offer. How about we settle this without any more trouble? I'll give you $200,000 and you drop everything. John looked at him sadly. Mr. Brian, you don't understand. It's not about the money. It's about respecting your mother's wishes and acknowledging that she knew exactly what she was doing. $500,000 then, Brian insisted, starting to sweat. It's not about the amount. John shook his head. Your mother left me this inheritance because she wanted me to be recognized as someone important in her life, and I was. When the session resumed, John surprised everyone by presenting an old shoebox. Your Honor, I have letters here that Mrs. Elizabeth wrote to me over the years. In them, she expresses gratitude for my care and shares her feelings about her children. Objection, Mr. Parker shouted. Those letters could be fake. That's why I also brought a handwriting analysis from a private expert. John showed another document, proving the authenticity of Mrs. Elizabeth's writing. The judge examined the letters and the reports. His expression changed completely as he read. Here it says, the judge announced, John, you are the son I chose to have. My biological children drifted away, but you were always here. I want you to know that when I'm gone, you'll have a place secured. You deserve all the good life has to offer. Karen began to cry. They weren't tears of anger, but of remorse. For the first time, he was understanding the abandonment they had imposed on their mother. There's more, John continued. Mrs. Elizabeth secretly funded my law studies for the last 5 years. She said I had potential and deserved a chance to better myself. Michael stood up, furious. That's impossible. My mother never told us that. Because you never asked about her life, John replied patiently. You'd show up, ask for money, complain about your own lives, and leave. When was the last time you asked how she was feeling? Brian lowered his head. He knew John was right. In recent years, his visits to his mother had always been brief and self-serving. I have here, John showed another envelope, receipts for payments to the private college where I took correspondence law courses, all paid by Mrs. Elizabeth, who insisted I not give up on my studies. Judge Wilson examined the documents with growing interest. It was clear Mrs. Elizabeth had carefully planned John's future. And there's one more witness, John said. Dr. Robert Anderson, the geriatric doctor who cared for Mrs. Elizabeth the last 3 years. He can confirm I was present at every appointment. The doctor was called and confirmed not only John's constant presence, but also recounted conversations where Mrs. Elizabeth expressed gratitude for the gardener and sadness over her children's distance. Mrs. Elizabeth always mentioned, Dr. Anderson said, that John was her only real family. She said her biological children had become strangers to her. Karen could no longer hold back her tears. For the first time in years, she was truly thinking of her mother as a person, not just as a source of inheritance. Mr. Parker tried one last move. We question Mrs. Elizabeth's mental capacity in her final months. Someone with early dementia can't make valid wills. John stood calmly. Doctor, I have medical reports from Mrs. Elizabeth's last 6 months, all confirming her full mental capacity, and more. I have authorized audio recordings where she clearly explains her reasons for the will. The courtroom fell silent as John played one recording. Mrs. Elizabeth's voice sounded clear and emotional. "John, I want you to record this so there's no doubt. I'm leaving half my property to you because you were the only one who stayed by my side. My children emotionally abandoned me years ago. You're my chosen family, the son of my heart." Karen stood and ran from the room sobbing. Brian and Michael exchanged glances, finally grasping the extent of their neglect. "There's more," the recording continued. "If my children challenge this will, I want John to know he has my full support even after I'm gone. He deserves everything I'm leaving him." Mr. Parker asked to withdraw from the case, citing ethical conflict. It was clear there was no way to dispute the will's validity with so much evidence. Michael made a final plea. "John, can we talk? Maybe we can reach an agreement that works for everyone." "Of course," John replied. "I've always been open to dialogue. But I won't give up what Mrs. Elizabeth wanted to leave me. It was her dream to see me recognized. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now, continuing. During another recess, the three siblings talked in the hallway. Karen had returned, her eyes still red. "We need to accept it," she said. "Mum was right. We abandoned her." "But the inheritance," Michael began. "Michael," Karen interrupted, "when was the last time you spent a holiday with Mum? When was the last time you called just to ask how she was doing?" Brian sighed heavily. "She was right. We only showed up when we needed something." And this man, Karen looked at John through the glass window of the courtroom. He truly cared for her like a son would. When the session resumed, John did something no one expected. He turned to the siblings with a proposal. "Mr. Brian, Karen, Michael," he said respectfully, "I know you're hurting. Losing a mother is painful, even when the relationship wasn't good. That's why I want to propose something." Judge Richard Wilson leaned forward, curious to hear. "I propose we turn part of the property into a community garden in memory of Mrs. Elizabeth. She always loved her plants. We can include you in the project, so we honor her memory by helping others." The siblings exchanged surprised glances. After everything they had done to take the inheritance from him, John was offering them a way to be part of it. "You'd really do that?" Brian asked, disbelieving. "Mrs. Elizabeth always taught me about forgiveness," John replied. "She'd want to see the family united, even if in a different way." Karen stood up, emotional. "John, we're sorry. You're right. We abandoned our mother. And there's one more thing." John opened another envelope. "Mrs. Elizabeth left individual letters for each of you. She asked me to give them to you after everything was settled." The courtroom fell completely silent. Even Judge Wilson seemed moved by the revelation. John handed the sealed letters to each sibling. With trembling hands, they opened them and began reading silently. Soon, tears streamed down all three faces. In Karen's letter, Mrs. Elizabeth wrote about how she missed the conversations they used to have when Karen was little, how she wished she had known her grandchildren better, how she understood adult life was busy, but a mother's love never changed. For Brian, she spoke of the pride she felt in his professional success, but also the loneliness she felt when he cancelled their Sunday lunches. She ended by saying there would always be forgiveness and a place for him in her heart. Michael's letter was about hope. Mrs. Elizabeth wrote that she knew he was struggling financially, but wished he had come to her just to talk, not only for loans. That love couldn't be bought with money. She loved us anyway," Michael whispered through tears. "Mrs. Elizabeth always loved you," John confirmed. "That's why these letters exist. She wanted you to know, even after she was gone." Judge Wilson had to call a recess to compose himself. In his 25 years on the bench, he had never witnessed anything so touching. When he returned, his demeanor had completely changed. The arrogant man who had mocked the gardener earlier was gone. "Mr. John," the judge said respectfully, "I apologize for my initial treatment. It's clear you not only understand the law, but also possess a wisdom in life that impresses me." John nodded without resentment. "Your Honor, I've worked my whole life with my hands in the soil. I've learned that plants grow best with constant care, not just when it suits the gardener. Relationships are the same. The analogy struck deep with everyone present. Based on all the evidence presented, Judge Wilson continued, I recognize the full validity of Elizabeth Miller's will. Mr. John Thompson has the legal right to the inheritance left to him. The siblings didn't object. They had realized the matter went far beyond legalities. But more than that, the judge said, I also acknowledge the emotional bond built through daily care, constant presence, and genuine love. That can't be measured in square feet or monetary value. Then John made his final surprise. From a bag he had brought, he took out 3 small pots with flower seedlings. These are cuttings from Mrs. Elizabeth's favorite rose bushes, he said, handing one to each sibling. She taught me how to grow them. She said she wanted you to have something alive to remember her by. Brian hugged the pot to his chest, crying. Karen did the same. Michael couldn't stop sobbing as he looked at the delicate seedling John had prepared especially for him. How did you know it would be like this? Karen asked. Mrs. Elizabeth told me, John replied with a sad smile. She knew you would contest the will, but she also knew that in the end, when you read the letters, you'd understand. That's why she asked me to prepare the cuttings. Judge Richard Wilson stood up. This hearing has taught me more about justice than many years on the bench. Mr. Thompson, you've turned a legal dispute into a family reconciliation. It was Mrs. Elizabeth who planned everything, John said humbly. She knew you needed to understand the difference between being present and just existing in someone's life. The siblings moved closer to John. Brian was the first to speak. John, we'd like to accept your proposal for the community garden, and we want to learn how to care for the plants our mother loved. It would be an honor to teach you, John replied. Mrs. Elizabeth would be very happy. Karen wiped her tears. Can we visit you sometimes? We'd love to hear more stories about our mother. My home will always be open to you, John said, just as it always was for Mrs. Elizabeth. Michael stepped forward shyly. John, I want to apologize. We treated you terribly and you didn't deserve it. Already forgiven, John answered. Your mother taught me that holding on to resentment is like watering weeds. It only makes them grow. Judge Wilson ended the hearing in an unusual way. In the name of justice, I declare that today we've learned that sometimes the truest families are the ones we choose through love and daily care. The courtroom applauded as John embraced each of the siblings. Miss Dorothy, who had watched everything from the gallery, cried with emotion. Mrs. Elizabeth would be so proud, she said. She managed to bring the family together even after she was gone. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. In the months that followed, the community garden began to take shape. John taught not only the Miller siblings but also several families in the neighborhood how to grow organic produce. Karen discovered she had a knack for tending herbs. Every week, she showed up with her young daughters to learn something new from John. The girls called him Grandpa John, and it made him beam with joy. Brian, who had always been the most distant, surprised everyone by revealing a talent for floral arrangements. He started making bouquets from the garden flowers to bring home to his wife. Michael faced his financial troubles with more maturity, accepting his siblings' help and even working part-time in the garden. John taught him that honest work, no matter how simple, brings dignity. You know, Brian said one Saturday morning as he watered the tomato plants, our mother always wanted to see us working together on something. She had foresight, John replied, adjusting the straw hat he now wore on weekends. She knew you just needed a reason to find each other again. The garden grew and became a local landmark. Whole families came on Saturdays to learn about sustainable farming and to hear John tell stories about Mrs. Elizabeth. She used to say that plants teach patience, John explained to a group of children. Pulling on a lettuce stalk won't make it grow faster. Everything has its own time. The children laughed and asked questions. John discovered he had a gift for teaching, something he'd never imagined in his life. Judge Wilson, who had retired 6 months after the trial, also became a regular visitor to the garden. He and John developed an unlikely friendship. That day changed how I see justice, confessed the former judge as he helped prune the rose bushes. I learned that what's legal isn't always what's right. "You just needed to see with your heart," John replied. "Mrs. Elizabeth always said the mind can deceive us, but the heart rarely makes mistakes." Miss Dorothy also became a constant presence in the garden. At 69, she discovered she still had much to contribute, especially by teaching traditional recipes using ingredients harvested on site. "This garden has become a little piece of heaven on earth," she would say whenever a new visitor arrived. A year after the trial, the Miller siblings decided to pay a special tribute to Mrs. Elizabeth. They planted a unique rose bush in the center of the garden with a plaque that read, "Elizabeth Miller, who taught us that true love is shown in daily presence." "Mom would have loved seeing this," said Karen, admiring how the rose bush was already full of buds. "She is seeing it," John replied with conviction. "I feel her presence every time I step on this soil." On that special day, something magical happened. Karen's 3 children were playing near the rose bush when the youngest 4-year-old Emma came running to John. "Grandpa John," she shouted excitedly, "Grandma Elizabeth's rose bloomed." Everyone rushed to see. The first rose from the bush had opened at that very moment, as if Mrs. Elizabeth was giving her approval to all that had happened. "It's a sign," Brian whispered, moved. "It's love," John corrected. "Her love keeps blooming in each of you." Michael, who had battled alcoholism in recent months with his family's support, knelt before the rose bush. "Mom, I promise I'll be the son you always wanted me to be," he said softly. John placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Mrs. Elizabeth knew you'd get there. That's why she left those words of hope in the letter." 2 years later, the community garden had expanded to 3 neighboring lots. The city of Portland had recognized the project as a model of urban agriculture and social sustainability. John, now 54 and officially a law school graduate, had opened a small office to help ordinary people with legal matters. He didn't charge high fees and always tried to resolve conflicts through dialogue. "The law doesn't have to be complicated," he explained to his clients. "Most of the time, people just need to talk honestly." Karen had returned to school and was studying education. Inspired by John's example of generosity, she wanted to work with underprivileged children. Brian opened a flower shop specializing in arrangements for special events. He often used flowers from the community garden and always shared the story of how he learned about plants with his customers. Michael overcame his addiction and worked as a garden monitor, teaching other young people about sustainable farming. He found purpose in helping those facing struggles similar to his own. "We never realized how wise our mother was," Karen said one Saturday afternoon while picking cherry tomatoes with her daughters. "She planted seeds long before she left," John agreed. "They just needed time and care to grow." Judge Wilson, who now spent his mornings helping in the garden, had written a book on restorative justice inspired by the case. The book became a reference in law schools across the country. "That trial taught me true justice isn't about punishment, but restoring relationships," he wrote in the preface. The story of John and the Miller family spread through the city and then across the state. Many families sought out the garden to resolve family conflicts, knowing they would find an environment of peace and reconciliation there. "People come here angry and leave hugging," observed Ms. Dorothy, now 71 and coordinator of the garden's culinary activities. One afternoon, 3 years after the trial, a special surprise happened. Dr. Robert Anderson, the doctor who had been a witness, brought his 8-year-old granddaughter to visit the garden. "Grandpa told me the story of Mrs. Elizabeth," the little girl said to John. "Is it true she planted flowers that turned into butterflies?" John smiled and crouched down to speak at her level. "Your great-grandmother used to say that when we care for flowers with love, they become so beautiful that even butterflies come to celebrate them." At that moment, as if by magic, several butterflies appeared, fluttering around Mrs. Elizabeth's rose bush. The little girl clapped in delight. "See?" John said with a wink. "Mrs. Elizabeth is still here tending to her garden." Years passed and the garden became a cultural landmark of the city. John was honored by the city council as an exemplary citizen and received an honorary doctorate from Portland State University for his social contributions. At the honorary graduation ceremony, John wore his best suit but didn't forget to carry a few sunflower seeds in his pocket, Mrs. Elizabeth's favorite flowers when she was a child. "These titles are nice," he said in his speech, "but the greatest diploma I ever received was Mrs. Elizabeth's affection and the trust she placed in me." The audience was moved when he symbolically planted a sunflower seed in the university's garden. "May this seed grow as a reminder to all that knowledge without love is just information," John concluded. "But knowledge with love transforms lives." 5 years after the trial, something unexpected happened. Michael, now married and a father to a baby, approached John with a special request. "John, Jennifer and I want you to be our son's godfather," he said emotionally. "You're truly family to us." John couldn't hold back his tears. "It would be an honor," he replied. "Mrs. Elizabeth would be overjoyed to know you consider me family." The baptism took place in the small chapel beside the community garden. The priest, who knew the family's story, gave a special sermon about chosen love and family of the heart. "Sometimes God gives us family through blood," the priest said. "Other times, he brings us people who become family through love and care." Karen and Brian were also godparents, along with their respective families. The celebration was held in the garden itself, with food made from ingredients harvested right there. "Mom would be so happy to see this," Brian said, holding his newborn nephew. "She is seeing it," John affirmed, "and she's proud of how you've all become better people." That night, after everyone had left, John stayed alone in the garden, gazing at the stars. He felt a deep peace in his heart, knowing he had fulfilled the mission Mrs. Elizabeth had entrusted to him. "Mrs. Elizabeth," he whispered to the sky, "you did it. Your family is united, and I've found my place in the world." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the rosebush at the garden's center, like a tender response from someone who had departed but never truly left. 6 years later, John had become a national reference in family conflict mediation. He traveled across the country teaching nonviolent communication techniques and peaceful dispute resolution. But he always returned to his garden in Portland, where it had all begun. That was his route, his safe harbor, the place where Mrs. Elizabeth had planted the seeds of his transformation. "The secret," he explained in his lectures, "isn't about winning or losing. It's about finding a path where everyone can grow together." The Miller family now gathered every Sunday in the garden for their community lunch. The children ran between the flower beds, while the adults cooked together, using ingredients they had grown with their own hands. "Remember when we barely spoke to each other?" Karen remarked during one of these gatherings. "Feels like another lifetime," Brian replied. "Our mother knew exactly what she was doing." Michael, now with 2 children of his own, had become a beloved storyteller among the garden's little ones. Every week he invented a new adventure starring Mrs. Elizabeth and her magical gardens. "Once upon a time there was a very wise woman," he always began, "who knew that true love is like a seed. The more you plant, the more it grows." The children adored the stories and always begged to hear them again. John was moved to see how Mrs. Elizabeth's memory lived on through the generations. Judge Richard Wilson, now 78, still visited the garden for his morning walks. He had become a passionate advocate for restorative justice and wrote articles on the subject. "That trial didn't just change you," he told John one sunny morning. "It changed my whole perspective on what truly matters in life." "Mrs. Elizabeth had that power," John replied. "She made people see what was really important." Ms. Dorothy, now 75, had become the garden's official chronicler. She wrote a weekly blog sharing updates and reflections on community life, read by thousands. "This garden has become a school of life," she wrote in one of her most famous posts. "Here, we learn that tending the earth means tending to one another." 7 years after the trial, the garden received a very special visit. A group of law students from various universities came to see the project that had inspired changes in conflict mediation education. "Mr. John," one young student asked, "how did you know that citing that specific code would change everything?" John smiled and led her to Mrs. Elizabeth's rosebush, now lush and full of blooms. "I didn't," he answered honestly. "I just knew I had to fight for her wishes, even if it seemed impossible." "But you studied law for so long," another student pressed. "The law gave me the tools," John explained. but it was Mrs. Elizabeth's love that gave me the courage to use them. The students were struck by the simplicity and depth of his answer. Many left rethinking their reasons for studying law. He taught us more in one afternoon than some professors do in a whole semester, one young man remarked on the bus ride back. 8 years later, something extraordinary happened. The community garden had inspired over 100 similar projects across the United States. John was invited to speak at the UN headquarters about urban farming and social cohesion. It all started with a woman who knew that true love shows up in daily presence, he told delegates from around the world. Karen, Brian, and Michael sat in the audience, proud to see the man they had once tried to humiliate become a global example of social transformation. Our mother would be the first to be surprised, Brian whispered to his siblings. Actually, no, Karen disagreed. She always knew John was special. We just couldn't see it. During his stay in Washington, D.C., John visited the Portland Botanical Gardens and symbolically planted a young Brazilian rose bush. This rose carries the love of a woman named Elizabeth, he told the local gardeners. May it bloom here and remind everyone that true love knows no borders. The sapling was planted in a special section dedicated to plants symbolizing family unity. A small plaque read, "In memory of Elizabeth Miller, who taught us that family is who stays." Back in the United States, John found the garden busier than ever. Lines of families waited to participate in the family mediation groups held every Saturday. People have discovered that here, problems are solved through conversation, explained Miss Dorothy. No need for court, no need for fights. John had developed his own mediation method, blending legal techniques with practical wisdom and lots of love. Families that arrived at war left hugging after just a few sessions. The secret is helping people remember why they loved each other in the first place, he explained to the new mediators who came to learn his techniques. 9 years after the trial, John made a decision that surprised everyone. He announced he would donate half of his inheritance to create a foundation focused on public legal education. Mrs. Elizabeth always wanted knowledge to be accessible to everyone, he explained during the launch of the Elizabeth Miller Foundation. His siblings fully supported the decision and became advisors to the foundation. Karen, now a graduate in education, developed methods to teach basic rights in simple and accessible ways. Brian created a therapeutic gardening program for those in family conflict. Michael specialized in working with at-risk youth. Each found their own way to honor their mother's memory, observed Judge Wilson, who had become the foundation's volunteer president. The foundation grew quickly, and within 2 years, it was serving over 2,000 families annually across the state of Oregon. The model was replicated in other states, and John became a national reference for access to justice. Mrs. Elizabeth planted a tiny seed, and it grew into an entire forest, remarked Ms. Dorothy, now 77, and still active as the coordinator of the original garden. 10 years after the trial, the Miller family organized a special celebration to mark a decade of transformation. Hundreds of people touched by their story attended. Judge Wilson, now 80 but still sharp and active, gave an emotional speech. 10 years ago, I was an arrogant judge who believed justice was just about coldly applying the law. John taught me that justice is about restoring relationships and healing wounds. The audience gave a standing ovation. John, now 58 with graying hair, stepped onto the small stage set up in the center of the garden. 10 years ago, he began, I was just a gardener with dreams of studying law. Mrs. Elizabeth taught me that our origins don't matter, only where our hearts want to go. Tears filled the crowd as they listened. The story had deeply moved each of them. This garden isn't just mine, John continued. It belongs to everyone who believes true love can change the world, one family at a time. Karen stood and asked to speak. John, on behalf of the Miller family, we want to say you're not just our brother in heart. You're the son our mother always wanted, and the one we needed to learn how to be. Brian and Michael joined their sister on stage. The three embraced John in a public display of love and gratitude that moved everyone. Mom would be proud, said Michael, now a mature and accomplished man, to see how her wisdom planted seeds that are still growing. That night, after everyone had left, John stayed alone in the garden, as he always did after special events. He looked at Mrs. Elizabeth's rose bush, now a majestic plant at the center of the garden. Mrs. Elizabeth, he said softly, 10 years later, and your lesson still echoes. You achieved the impossible. You turned a legal dispute into a lesson in love. A gentle breeze made the rose petals dance, as if Mrs. Elizabeth were whispering words of affection and approval to her son in heart. The next morning, John woke with a special feeling. He knew a new chapter was beginning. He had decided to write a book telling the whole story, so other families could find inspiration and paths to reconciliation. It will be a gift for Mrs. Elizabeth, he said to Karen, who had volunteered to help with the writing. And for all the families who need to remember that true love always finds a way, she replied, moved by the project. The book took 2 years to complete. Seeds of Love: How an Inheritance Transformed a Family became a national bestseller and was translated into multiple languages. John donated all royalties to the foundation, which could expand its work even further. The story of Mrs. Elizabeth and her chosen family inspired millions around the world. Who would have thought, commented Judge Wilson during the book launch, that a trial in a small town would become a global lesson on love and justice? 15 years after the trial that changed everything, John sat on the porch of the house Mrs. Elizabeth had left him. Now married to Susan, a retired teacher he met during a talk on family mediation, he watched the grandchildren playing in the yard. "Grandpa John," shouted Emma, now 12 and Karen's daughter, "tell us again the story of great-grandma Elizabeth." John smiled and called all the children closer. There were 8 in total, the children and grandchildren of Karen, Brian and Michael, plus the 2 stepchildren Susan brought into the marriage. "Once upon a time," he began as he always did, "there was a very wise woman who knew that family isn't just who you're born with, but who chooses to stay together." The children settled on the floor, hanging on every word. Even though they knew the story by heart, they loved hearing Grandpa tell them about the great-grandmother they never met, but whose presence filled every corner of that loving home. "And so," John finished as always, "we discovered that the greatest treasure wasn't in the inheritance she left behind, but in the love she planted in our hearts." One of the children raised a hand. "Grandpa, is great-grandma Elizabeth in heaven?" John looked at the rosebush visible through the window, still blooming beautifully after all these years. "She's everywhere true love exists," he answered. "In the flowers we tend, in the hands that reach out to help, in the hearts that know how to forgive." At that moment, as always happened when they spoke about Mrs. Elizabeth, a butterfly landed on the windowsill. The children clapped, thinking it was magic. John knew maybe it really was. The end. "And you, what did you think of this touching story about love, family, and second chances? Do you know of a similar situation where a simple person showed wisdom and generosity? Share your thoughts on the Miller family's transformation in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming stories.